May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The clock on the wall of Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters showed 800 hours. Standing before his commander was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton holding a folder. It contained intelligence so precise, so specific, that to anyone outside that room, it would have seemed impossible. "The Japanese are coming to Midway," Layton announced. "They will approach from the northwest on bearing 325 bug. They will be spotted approximately 175 miles from the island. The attack will commence at 0700 hours on June 4th. Admiral Nimitz looked at his intelligence officer with the calm that had established him as one of America's most trusted commanders. "You're telling me you know exactly where Yamamoto will be, when he will arrive, and what he plans to do?" "That's correct, sir," Layton replied. "We can read every order, every position report, every communication between Japanese commanders. Their entire battle plan is known to us." Silence descended upon the room. In that moment, Nimitz realized the United States Navy possessed something more powerful than any bomb, more devastating than any battleship. America could read Japan's deepest secrets. What none of them fully grasped yet was that this moment represented the culmination of 2 decades of methodical, patient work. The code-breaking triumph that would change the course of the Pacific War hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of years of preparation, brilliant mathematics, and the tireless dedication of men working in basement rooms far from any battlefield. The intelligence Layton presented would allow Nimitz to set a trap so perfect and complete that historians would later call the resulting battle the most decisive naval engagement in American history. But the story of how America gained the ability to read Japanese naval communications began long before Pearl Harbor, in the quiet offices of a handful of mathematicians and linguists who foresaw war years before the first bombs fell. Laying the foundation, the birth of Navy cryptology, the foundation was laid in the early 1920s when a young naval officer, Lawrence Safford, recognized that future wars would be fought not just with ships and guns, but with information. Safford, who would later be called the father of Navy cryptology, established the Navy's first organized code-breaking unit in 1924. It was a modest beginning, just a few officers working with paper and pencil, attempting to understand the diplomatic and military communications of potential adversaries. Safford understood that Japan, rising as a Pacific power, would eventually challenge American interests. He began recruiting men with unique talents, mathematicians who could see patterns in chaos, linguists who had lived in Japan, and radio operators who could pluck signals from the air. By the early 1930s, the Navy had established intercept stations across the Pacific, one at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, another at Cavite in the Philippines, and a third working from Washington. These stations would eventually form the backbone of America's signals intelligence network. Joseph Rochefort, and the JN-25 code among the young officers Safford recruited was Joseph Rochefort, a man whose career would become inseparable from the breaking of Japanese codes. Rochefort had joined the Navy in 1918 at age 17, lying about his age to enlist during World War I. He showed an immediate talent for puzzles and languages, and his superiors noticed. Instead of sending him to sea, they assigned him to the code and signal section in Washington, where, working with the Navy's earliest cryptographic efforts, Rochefort discovered his calling. In 1929, the Navy sent Rochefort to Tokyo to master the Japanese language. For 3 years, he lived in Japan, studying not just the language, but also the culture, the military structure, and the way Japanese officers communicated and thought. It was during this assignment that Rochefort met another young officer who would prove crucial to the coming war, Edwin Layton. Based on their shared conviction that understanding the enemy's language and culture would be essential in any future conflict, the two men formed a friendship based on their shared fascination with Japan. The Japanese introduced their most sophisticated naval code on June 1, 1939, American. Cryptanalysts designated it JN-25. JN simply meant Japanese Navy. 25 indicated it was the 25th Japanese naval system the Americans had identified. This was no simple substitution cipher. JN-25 was an enciphered code, a 2-step system that made it extraordinarily difficult to break. First, Japanese operators would look up words and phrases in a code book containing approximately 33,000 entries. A 5-digit number group represented each word or phrase. Second, the Japanese added a layer of security using additive tables. The operator would take the 5-digit code group, then add another 5-digit number from a separate book, creating a third 5-digit group that bore no obvious relationship to the original. This additive changed regularly, sometimes as often as every few months. To read a message, American cryptanalysts first had to strip away the additive, then match the resulting code groups to their meanings in the codebook. By late 1940, working together, American and British cryptanalysts had made progress against JN-25. They understood the system's structure, and they had identified perhaps 10% of the code groups, approximately 3,800 out of 33,000. But their work was painstakingly slow. Full penetration of the code seemed years away with only a handful of analysts and limited intercepts. Starting over, JN-25B and the setbacks then, on December 1, 1940, the Japanese introduced a major change, an entirely new code book, which cryptanalysts later designated JN-25B. Every code group meaning had changed. The cryptanalysts had to start over. They began the slow work of rebuilding their knowledge, identifying code groups one by one through brilliant deductive work, through guessing at common phrases, and through traffic analysis. By October 1941, progress was being made again. Perhaps the 500 code groups had been recovered. Hopes were rising that by the following spring, they might be reading current traffic with reasonable comprehension. Those hopes suffered a setback on December 4, 1941. Just 3 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese changed their additive tables to a new system designated Additive 8. While this was not as catastrophic as a complete codebook change, the cryptanalysts still had to recover the new additives before they could read messages, a process that would take weeks. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the codebreakers felt the attack as a personal failure. They had been working on JN-25 for over 2 years. Might they have detected some indication of the approaching attack force if they had achieved better penetration earlier, or if the December 4th additive change hadn't temporarily blinded them? The question would haunt them, particularly Joseph Rochefort, who had been assigned to take command of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor in June 1941. Station Hypo, the nerve center. Transformation began in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor. The building, an unremarkable concrete structure near the submarine base, sat mostly unnoticed. Down a narrow stairway past security checkpoints in its basement was a room that would become the nerve center of the Pacific War, Station Hypo. 60 feet long, windowless, and illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat generated by IBM tabulating machines and the bodies of dozens of analysts working around the clock. This was where Joseph Rochefort and his team would wage their war. Rochefort was, by any standard, an eccentric commander. He often worked 72-hour stretches without leaving the basement. Because the air conditioning made the room frigid at night, he wore slippers and a smoking jacket. He went days without shaving and drank coffee by the gallon, chain-smoking. But he demanded excellence from himself and his team. He had handpicked many of them. Thomas Dyer, a brilliant cryptanalyst who would prove instrumental in breaking JN-25 and who had developed procedures for using IBM machines to process encrypted messages. Alva Laswell, a Japanese language expert who had studied in Tokyo and could understand the nuances of military communications. Ham Wright, a cryptanalyst who worked closely with Dyer on the most difficult code groups. And Joseph Finnegan, a mathematician whose work on date-time groups would prove crucial. Dozens of enlisted men were also there, many of them musicians from the band of the USS California, which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. These men, assigned to Hypo because they had nowhere to go, many proved to have the analytical and mathematical minds needed for code breaking. Rochefort believed that musicians who could read sheet music possessed pattern recognition skills that translated perfectly to spotting recurring number groups in encrypted messages. The breakthrough. Finding AF. The work was tedious beyond description. An intercepted message might contain 200 5-digit groups. Each group had to be processed. First, strip away the additive if it had been identified. Then, attempt to match the resulting code group to its meaning. At the start of 1942, with 33,000 possible meanings and only a few hundred identified, most of the message would remain gibberish. But sometimes they would get lucky. A location there, a code group for a ship name here, perhaps a date, though those were super-enciphered with an additional layer of security. From these fragments, the analysts would try to piece together meaning. What ships were being discussed, where were they going, and when would they arrive? Traffic analysis helped fill in the gaps. Even if you couldn't read the messages, you could learn much from who was sending to whom, from what locations, and how often. An operation was being planned when radio traffic suddenly increased between certain commands. A ship's call sign going silent meant the vessel was maintaining radio silence, probably because it was approaching a target. The breakthrough began in late December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, when Station Cast in the Philippines made the first progress on the new additive system. They shared their findings with Hypo and the codebreakers in Washington. The cooperation between stations, though it would later cause bitter bureaucratic conflicts, would prove essential. By January 1942, Rochefort's team was reading parts of JN-25B, perhaps one word in 5. Not complete messages, but it was enough to begin understanding Japanese intentions. They learned the Japanese were planning operations in the South Pacific. In February, they detected preparations for an attack on Port Moresby in New Guinea. The codebreakers tracked their movements in March and April as Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, providing Nimitz with intelligence that allowed him to position his forces for maximum effect. The work was exhausting. Dyer and Rochefort alternated 24-hour duty watches that often extended to 36 or even 48 hours straight. The basement room became their universe. They worked there, ate there, and slept on cots there until their minds were numb. They often dreamed in 5-digit number groups when they did manage to sleep. The IBM machines clattered constantly, sorting punch cards, looking for patterns. The machines could process in hours what would take humans weeks, but the machines could only find patterns. Human intelligence was still required to interpret them, to make the intuitive leaps that separated useful intelligence from noise. By April 1942, Hypo was reading approximately 20% of JN-25B messages. This was remarkable progress, achieved in just 4 months. More importantly, they were reading the right 20%. They had identified code groups for locations, for ship names, for military units, and for common phrases used in operational planning. When a message came in discussing an upcoming operation, they could often determine what, where, and approximately when, even if large portions of the message remained unreadable. This was the situation when, in late April 1942, the analysts began detecting references to a major operation planned for early June. The target was identified by a code group that appeared frequently in the intercepts. The question that would define the next month was simple but critical. What did AF represent? The cryptanalysts had determined that the letter A seemed to designate locations in or near the Hawaiian Islands. They had seen AH used for Oahu. AF might be another location in that general area. Geography and logic suggested Midway Atoll. The tiny island sat 1,000 miles northwest of Honolulu, at the far end of the Hawaiian chain. It was strategically important. If Japan took Midway, they would have an advance base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. But other analysts, particularly those in Washington, disagreed. Some thought AF referred to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska or even Johnston Island. Others argued that the Japanese might be planning another thrust south toward Samoa or Fiji. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet in Washington, was skeptical. He had never fully trusted Rochefort, viewing him as insubordinate because he often bypassed the chain of command to report directly to Nimitz through Layton. Rochefort needed proof. If Nimitz positioned his limited carrier forces to defend Midway, and Rochefort was wrong, with the Japanese striking elsewhere, the consequences would be catastrophic. The U.S. Navy had only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific. Enterprise and Hornet were in good condition, while Yorktown had been badly damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. Against these 3, the Japanese could field at least 6 carriers, including the 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had never suffered a naval defeat. His forces were confident, experienced, and had been winning steadily for 6 months. A mistake by Nimitz could mean the loss of America's entire carrier force, and the Pacific War would be lost before it truly began. The fate of the war in the Pacific would turn on whether AF was Midway. The deception. In mid-May 1942, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes of Rochefort's staff proposed an elegant solution. If AF was indeed Midway, and if the Japanese were reading American radio traffic, perhaps they could trick the Japanese into confirming it. The plan was simple but brilliant. Midway would send an uncoded radio message, one the Japanese could easily intercept, reporting a mechanical problem, something specific enough to be believable, urgent enough that the Japanese might report it in their own coded traffic. Rochefort took the idea to Layton, who presented it to Nimitz. Nimitz approved immediately. On May 19th, Nimitz sent a message to the commanding officer at Midway via submarine cable, a communication line the Japanese could not intercept. The message instructed Midway to broadcast in plain language, with no encryption, that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and they urgently needed fresh water supplies. On May 20th, the message went out from Midway. Rochefort and his team waited anxiously. Would the Japanese take the bait? 2 days later, on May 22nd, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence message sent from Tokyo to multiple commands. It stated that AF was reporting a water shortage and would need to transport additional water for the upcoming operation. The room erupted in controlled celebration. AF was Midway. There was no doubt now. Rochefort immediately sent word to Layton, who briefed Nimitz that same day. The commander of the Pacific Fleet now knew with certainty where the Japanese would strike. The final pieces of the puzzle, but knowing the target was only the first piece of the puzzle. Nimitz needed to know when the attack would come, and in what strength. Through the last week of May, Hypo worked around the clock. Every intercepted message was attacked with desperate intensity. They needed the date. Finnegan focused on the super-enciphered date time groups, the most secure part of the Japanese system. He searched through thousands of messages, looking for patterns in how the Japanese encoded dates. On May 25th, he found the key. It was a brilliant piece of cryptanalysis that would allow them to read the timing of Japanese operations. The team immediately began processing the backlog of messages about the AF operation. On May 26th, the picture became clear. The Japanese were assembling a massive force: 4 carriers, 2 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, an invasion force with troops to occupy Midway after the airstrike, a submarine cordon to intercept American reinforcements, and a diversionary force that would strike the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north. The main strike against Midway would come in the first week of June, most likely June 4th or 5th. The attack would come from the northwest, approaching Midway at dawn to launch their aircraft. The improbable briefing on the morning of May 27, 1942. As USS Yorktown entered Pearl Harbor with visible battle damage from Coral Sea, Edwin Layton walked into Nimitz's office for the daily intelligence briefing. What he was about to tell the Admiral would seem almost impossible. The intelligence from Station Hypo was so detailed, so precise that it included not just the timing and the target, but the approximate distance at which they would launch their aircraft, the exact bearing from which the Japanese would approach, and even the estimated time of the attack. Layton's prediction that the Japanese would approach from bearing 325 degrams at approximately 175 miles from Midway, with an attack commencing around 0700 hours on June 4th, was based on decrypted Japanese operational orders. Nimitz listened carefully. He asked about confidence levels. Layton was certain. This was not analysis. This was reading the enemy's plans directly from their own communications. Nimitz made his decision. He would position his carriers northwest of Midway, where they could ambush the approaching Japanese force. The Japanese expected surprise. They didn't know that American codebreakers had penetrated JN-25. Instead, they would be the ones surprised. They had nowhere to go, so these men were assigned to Hypo. Many, it turned out, possessed the analytical and mathematical minds required for codebreaking. Rochefort's belief was that musicians, being able to read sheet music, had pattern recognition skills that perfectly translated to spotting recurring number groups within encrypted messages. The work at Station Hypo was exhausting and tedious. Intercepted messages, hundreds of them per day, arrived as long strings of 5-digit numbers. By early 1942, every single message had to be processed. First, analysts stripped away the additive values, provided those values had been recovered. Next, they attempted to match the resulting code groups to known meanings, but the majority of code groups remained a mystery. Analysts kept card files for every occurrence of every code group, meticulously noting the sender, the recipient, and the context, trying to deduce meanings through association and repetition. If a code group frequently appeared in messages concerning carrier operations, it might signify fuel, aircraft, ammunition, or carrier. The analysts were forced to use painstaking cross-referencing, intuition, and logic to narrow down the possibilities. The IBM tabulating machines provided assistance. These were the same machines corporations used for data processing and accounting. During the 1930s, Thomas Dyer had pioneered their use in cryptanalysis. At Station Hypo, punch card operators transferred intercepted messages onto cards. The machines could cross-reference, count, and sort at speeds impossible for human operators. When a specific code group appeared, the machine could instantly retrieve every previous occurrence. This allowed analysts to spot patterns that would have taken weeks to find manually. Day and night the machines clattered. The punch card operators, many of them women from the Navy clerical staff, became expert at preparing data for the cryptanalysts to examine. The recovery and breakthrough progress came slowly through early 1942 and the winter of 1941. By Christmas 1941, Station Hypo had recovered enough of the new additive system to begin reading portions of messages once more. By February, new code groups were being identified daily. By April 1942, approximately 20% of intercepted traffic was comprehensible. Analysts could read about 1 word in 5. This sounds minimal, but in military communications it was often sufficient. Japanese naval messages followed standard formats. Operational orders, personnel assignments, fuel status, and position reports all used predictable structures. If analysts knew the message type and could read 20% of the words, they could often deduce the rest. One breakthrough proved especially valuable. Joseph Finnegan, the mathematician, noticed that date and time information in messages was encrypted using a special system. The Japanese had enciphered dates and times with extra care because they did not want to reveal when operations would occur. Finnegan, however, discovered a pattern. He developed what he called a 12x31 garble check, a mathematical method for testing whether a suspected date-time code group was correct. By April 1942, Station Hypo was able to determine the dates mentioned in messages, even when the rest of the message remained partially obscure. This would prove crucial in the weeks ahead. Identifying the target. AF through early May and April 1942, Station Hypo analysts noticed increasing references to an objective designated AF. The Japanese used 2-letter codes for locations to maintain secrecy. Pearl Harbor was AH, the Aleutians were AO, but AF appeared with unusual frequency. Messages mentioned supply ships, air units, and troop concentrations, all connected with AF. The traffic strongly suggested a major operation was being planned, but where was AF? Some analysts in Washington believed it might be the Aleutians, America's northernmost territory. Others thought perhaps it was the west coast of the United States or Port Moresby in New Guinea. Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo were convinced AF was Midway Island, a small American outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. But belief wasn't enough. Nimitz needed proof before he could commit his limited carrier forces. The water ruse in mid-May 1942, Captain Wilfred Holmes, a submarine officer assigned to Station Hypo, proposed a clever solution. If AF was Midway, perhaps they could trick the Japanese into confirming it. Holmes suggested that Midway be instructed to send an uncoded radio message reporting a problem with their water distillation equipment, stating that fresh water was running short. If Japanese intelligence was monitoring Midway, which they surely were, they would intercept this message. If AF was indeed Midway, Japanese communications might then reference the water shortage. Nimitz approved the plan. On May 19th and 20th, 1942, Midway sent the uncoded message via underwater cable to Pearl Harbor, which then transmitted it by radio in a low-level cipher the Japanese had already broken. The message requested emergency shipments of fresh water and reported mechanical problems with the water distillation plant. Station Hypo analysts waited. Within 48 hours, on May 22nd, they intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. After stripping away the encryption, the message stated that AF was short of water. It was the confirmation Rochefort needed. AF was definitely Midway. The analysts could now focus all their efforts on determining what forces the Japanese would commit and when the attack would come. Final intelligence picture. The intelligence picture came into focus rapidly during the final days of May. Station Hypo was now processing between 500 and 1,000 messages per day as Japanese units coordinated their movements toward the objective. Each message added detail to the emerging picture. The cryptanalysts identified the carriers that would participate: Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, Soryu. All four had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They tracked the departure dates of various units from Japanese bases. They plotted the approach route. They estimated the composition of the invasion force. On May 27, 1942, the same morning that the damaged carrier, USS Yorktown, limped into Pearl Harbor from the Battle of the Coral Sea, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton entered Admiral Nimitz's office with his intelligence assessment. Layton and Nimitz met every morning at 8 for the daily intelligence briefing, but this briefing was different. Layton had information so precise that Nimitz would later call it almost unbelievable. The Japanese, Layton explained, would approach Midway from the northwest. They would be spotted at bearing 325° and approximately 175 miles from the island. The attack would begin at approximately 700 hours on the morning of June 4, 1942. 4 fleet carriers would provide the striking power, supported by destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. An invasion force with troop transports would follow. The Japanese plan called for the carriers to destroy American air defenses on Midway, then cover the landing of ground forces who would seize the island. What made Layton's briefing remarkable was not just the detail, but the confidence with which he presented it. This was not analysis based on incomplete information or guesswork. This was intelligence derived from reading the enemy's communications. Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had broken JN-25 well enough to read Japanese operational orders. They knew the enemy's plan as clearly as if they had been sitting in Admiral Yamamoto's planning sessions. Nimitz absorbed the information calmly. He asked questions about confidence levels, about what might happen if the intelligence was wrong, and about alternative interpretations. Layton answered each question. He was confident. Multiple messages from multiple sources all told the same story. Station Hypo had checked and rechecked their analysis. The Japanese were coming to Midway, and they were coming on June 4th. Nimitz's decision. Nimitz made his decision. He would position his carriers northwest of Midway, where they could ambush the approaching Japanese force. The Japanese expected surprise. They didn't know that American codebreakers had penetrated JN-25. Instead, they would be the ones surprised. But Nimitz faced a problem. USS Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, sat in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. Navy inspectors estimated the carrier would need 3 months of repairs before she could return to service. Nimitz gave them 3 days. He needed every available carrier for the coming battle. 400 civilian workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard swarmed aboard Yorktown. They worked around the clock, welding and cutting, patching holes, and replacing damaged sections. To provide power for the welding equipment, the shipyard implemented rolling electrical blackouts across Oahu. 72 hours after Yorktown entered dry dock, she steamed out of Pearl Harbor, repair crews still aboard, to join the task force assembling north of Midway. The battle on June 3, 1942, American patrol aircraft spotted Japanese ships approaching from the west. On the morning of June 4th, exactly when Layton had predicted, radar operators on Midway detected aircraft approaching from the northwest. At 07:02 hours, just 2 minutes after Layton's predicted time, Japanese aircraft struck Midway. But the American carriers were not at Pearl Harbor as the Japanese had expected. They were positioned northeast of Midway, waiting. When Nimitz received the first contact reports that morning, he remarked to Layton that his prediction had been off by only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes. It was one of the most accurate pieces of tactical intelligence in naval history. The Battle of Midway raged from June 4th through June 7th, 1942. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their aircraft being rearmed on deck. All 3 were burning within minutes and would later sink. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but American aircraft found and destroyed Hiryu that afternoon, in exchange for the destroyer USS Hammond, which was torpedoed while assisting the damaged carrier, and Yorktown. The United States Navy had sunk all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. The Americans lost 145 aircraft and 307 men. The Japanese lost approximately 290 aircraft and 3,057 men. More importantly, Japan lost 4 experienced carrier crews, pilots, mechanics, and support personnel, who could not be replaced. The Japanese Navy would never again achieve the striking power it possessed before Midway, the ultra advantage. The intelligence advantage did not end at Midway. Station Hypo continued breaking JN-25 throughout the war. Japanese commanders never realized their codes had been compromised. They continued using JN-25, periodically changing codebooks and additives, but the cryptanalysts kept pace with each change. The intelligence derived from JN-25, given the codename Ultra, shaped every major American operation in the Pacific. American commanders knew in advance when Japanese forces moved. American submarines waited along their routes when Japanese convoys sailed. American bombers knew where to strike when Japanese aircraft deployed to new bases. Of the most dramatic uses of ultra-intelligence came in April 1943. American cryptanalysts decoded a message revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The message provided his exact timing and route. Admiral Nimitz ordered an interception. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal flew 500 miles to intercept Yamamoto's transport. They arrived exactly on course, exactly on time, and shot down both Japanese aircraft. Yamamoto died in the jungle of Bougainville. The operation succeeded because American cryptanalysts could read the Japanese Navy's most secure communications. It was Operation Vengeance, and it demonstrated the power of signals intelligence to change the course of war. Bureaucracy and obscurity. The intelligence triumph at Midway nearly ended in disaster 1 month after the battle. On June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story by reporter Stanley Johnston titled, "Navy Had Word of Japan to Strike at Sea." The article strongly implied that the Navy had advanced knowledge of the Japanese battle plan through code-breaking. Johnston had been aboard USS Lexington during the Battle of the Coral Sea and had seen classified dispatches. His article came dangerously close to revealing that American cryptanalysts could read Japanese codes. President Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox were furious. They demanded Johnston be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. A grand jury investigated but declined to indict. Fortunately, the Japanese either didn't see the article or didn't understand its implications. They continued using JN-25, never suspecting it had been compromised. Joseph Rochefort received no medal for his achievement. In October 1942, despite having provided the intelligence that enabled the victory at Midway, Rochefort was relieved from Station Hypo and reassigned to oversee construction of floating dry docks on the West Coast. The removal resulted from bureaucratic infighting in Washington. Admiral Ernest King's intelligence staff, led by Captain John Redman and his brother, Commander Joseph Redman, resented that Rochefort communicated directly with Nimitz rather than routing intelligence through Washington. They also disagreed with some of Rochefort's assessments. When Admiral Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway, Admiral King denied the recommendation. Rochefort would spend the remainder of the war in obscurity. His contributions were unknown outside a small circle of intelligence professionals. The injustice haunted those who knew what Rochefort had accomplished. Edwin Layton, Rochefort's friend and the man who worked with him through those critical months, wrote in his memoir that the treatment of Rochefort was one of the great injustices of the war. Admiral Nimitz agreed. After the war, Nimitz supported efforts to gain recognition for Rochefort, but the intelligence bureaucracy resisted. In 1957, Station Hypo received a Presidential Unit citation for its work before and during the Battle of Midway. Rochefort attended the ceremony in Washington. It was some recognition, but not what he deserved. He died on July 20th, 1976 in Torrance, California, at age 76, still without the individual recognition his achievement warranted. Posthumous justice a decade after Rochefort's death, the Navy finally acknowledged its error. On May 30th, 1986, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal at a White House ceremony. Captain Rochefort's children attended, along with senior defense officials, including Vice President George Bush and Vice Admiral William Studeman, Director of the National Security Agency. The citation praised Rochefort's decisive contributions to the U.S. victory at Midway and stated that his brilliant and untiring efforts were largely responsible for the victory. Recognition came far too late, but it restored Rochefort's place in history. Today, the Navy's intelligence school at Dam Neck, Virginia, bears Rochefort's name, ensuring that future intelligence officers will know the story of the man who broke Japan's codes and changed the course of the Pacific War. Edwin Layton, Rochefort's friend and the man who briefed Admiral Nimitz on May 27, 1942, also went unrecognized for decades. He served as Nimitz's intelligence officer throughout the Pacific War, providing the Admiral with accurate assessments that shaped every major operation. After the war, Layton retired with the rank of Rear Admiral but remained silent about the code-breaking operation. The work of Station Hypo remained classified. Not until the 1970s, when the National Security Agency began declassifying World War II signals intelligence materials, could the story be told. Layton co-authored a memoir, I Was There, Pearl Harbor and Midway, Breaking the Secrets, published in 1985, shortly after his death. The book provided the first detailed public account of how American cryptanalysts broke JN-25 and enabled the victory at Midway. Lawrence Safford, the father of Navy cryptology, who had established the code-breaking program in 1924 and recruited men like Rochefort, also suffered from bureaucratic politics. In February 1942, at the height of the effort against JN-25, Safford was removed from his position and sidelined for the remainder of the war. The same Washington power struggles that later removed Rochefort had struck Safford first. He retired as a captain and died in 1973. His foundational contributions to American signals intelligence remained largely unknown to the public. In 1999, the National Security Agency inducted Safford into its Hall of Honor, recognizing him as the man who built the foundation upon which all subsequent Navy code-breaking operations rested. Lessons of Station Hypo. The personal cost to the codebreakers deserves recognition. These men worked in obscurity, unable to tell even their families what they did. They couldn't share their frustrations or their triumphs. When the war ended, they were forbidden from speaking publicly about their work for decades. The documents remained classified until the 1970s and 80s. By the time the story could be told, many of the participants had died. Rochefort died in 1976, just as the first books about Midway code-breaking were being published. He never received full public recognition for his achievement. The organizational lessons from Station Hypo influenced the creation of modern intelligence agencies. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, adopted many of the practices developed at Hypo. The importance of language expertise and cultural knowledge. The emphasis on collaboration between multiple collection and analysis sites. The use of technology to process large volumes of data. And the need for analysts to have direct access to operational commanders. These principles, proven effective in the Pacific War, became foundational to American signals intelligence. The story also reveals the importance of individual brilliance in intelligence work. Finnegan's breakthrough on date-time encryption, Rochefort's intuitive understanding of Japanese thinking, Dyer's mathematical insights, Laswell's language expertise, Holmes's clever water ruse, and Layton's ability to communicate intelligence effectively to Nimitz. All of these individual contributions were essential. No single person could have broken JN-25 alone. It required a team of specialists, each bringing unique skills, but it also required leadership that could harness those skills effectively. Rochefort created an environment where brilliant but eccentric individuals could thrive. He trusted their judgments, gave them the resources they needed, and protected them from bureaucracy. The technology used at Station Hypo, primitive by modern standards, was revolutionary for its time. The IBM punch-card machines could process data at speeds that seemed miraculous in 1942, but they were loud, temperamental, and required constant maintenance. The basement room where they operated was filled with the smell of machine oil and the clatter of the card readers. The machines would break down at critical moments. Enlisted men became expert at field repairs, keeping the equipment running through determination and improvisation. These early experiences with automated data processing influenced the development of computers after the war. Several of the Station Hypo veterans went on to work in the nascent computer industry. The role of Japanese language expertise cannot be overstated. Even after a code group was identified, the message still had to be translated. Japanese is a complex language with multiple levels of formality and indirect communication patterns. Military Japanese had its own grammatical structures and vocabulary. The translators at Station Hypo had to understand not only the words, but also the context, the cultural assumptions, and the way Japanese officers communicated. Rochefort's years in Tokyo proved invaluable for this. He understood how Japanese military officers thought. He could infer intentions from subtle word choices, reading between the lines. The traffic analysis component of the intelligence effort was equally important. Even when messages couldn't be decrypted, valuable information could be gained from the patterns of communication, which commands were sending messages to which other commands, at what times, and how frequently. A sudden increase in traffic between the carrier divisions and the combined fleet headquarters suggested an operation was being planned. Radio silence from specific units indicated they were at sea, probably approaching a target. Changes in radio frequencies or call signs often preceded major operations. The traffic analysts at Hypo tracked all of these patterns, building a picture of Japanese naval organization and operational tempo. The human factor in this achievement extended beyond the core analytical team. The radio operators who manned intercept stations across the Pacific, from Alaska to Australia to Hawaii, worked in difficult conditions to capture Japanese transmissions. Radio signals bounced unpredictably off the ionosphere. Atmospheric conditions could make signals fade in and out. Japanese operators sometimes transmitted at high speed, making accurate copying difficult. The American operators had to have endless patience and perfect ears. They sat for hours with headphones copying strings of numbers that meant nothing to them, knowing that somewhere analysts would turn those numbers into intelligence, secrecy, and strategy. The security surrounding this operation was extraordinary. Very few people knew that JN-25 had been broken. Nimitz knew, his senior staff knew, the analysts at Hypo knew. But most of the Pacific Fleet operated without knowledge that America could read Japanese communications. This secrecy was essential. If the Japanese suspected their codes were compromised, they would immediately change their systems, and all the work of months would be lost. This created difficult situations. Intelligence would reveal that Japanese submarines were waiting in ambush along certain routes. But commanders couldn't simply avoid those routes without the risk of revealing the source of their information. Instead, they had to arrange for patrol planes to accidentally discover the submarines, providing a plausible explanation for the changed routes. The immediate aftermath of Midway saw an expansion of the code-breaking effort. More analysts were recruited. More intercept stations were established. The IBM machines were upgraded. By late 1942, the Navy was processing thousands of Japanese messages per week. The intelligence product was distributed through a system called Ultra, borrowed from the British designation for intelligence derived from broken codes. Ultra reports went to commanders with strict security protocols. They were printed on special paper that would dissolve in water if the ship was sunk. They were never to be discussed over radio. Actions based on ultra-intelligence had to be disguised to prevent the enemy from suspecting the source. This intelligence guided every major American operation in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. When American forces invaded Guadalcanal in August 1942, ultra-intelligence revealed the timing and strength of Japanese reinforcement attempts. This allowed American naval forces to intercept and destroy several Tokyo Express runs that were bringing troops and supplies to the island. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Ultra-intelligence gave Admiral Raymond Spruance detailed information about Japanese carrier locations and aircraft strength. This contributed to the destruction of Japanese naval aviation in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, The strategic impact. Intelligence also had strategic implications beyond tactical battles. By reading Japanese communications about fuel shortages, shipping losses, and resource constraints, American planners understood that Japan's war economy was faltering. This influenced decisions about which islands to invade and which to bypass. It guided the submarine campaign that strangled Japanese commerce. By 1944, American submarines armed with ultra-intelligence were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Japan's island garrisons were being starved of supplies. The home islands were running short of oil, rubber, and other critical resources. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders, though they didn't know the source of their problems, was significant. They began to believe that American intelligence was almost supernatural in its accuracy. How else could the Americans always be in the right place at the right time? How else could they anticipate every Japanese move? This belief led to second-guessing and paranoia. Japanese commanders became reluctant to commit to operations, fearing that somehow the Americans would know in advance. This defensive mindset, combined with the actual material losses Japan had suffered, meant that after Midway, Japan never regained the strategic initiative. The code-breaking effort also influenced Allied strategy in the broader war. The intelligence from the Pacific was shared with British and American planners working on the European theater. The techniques developed by Station Hypo influenced the work at Bletchley Park, where British codebreakers were attacking German Enigma codes. There was a cross-pollination of methods, ideas, and technologies. The experience gained in breaking JN-25 informed post-war cryptanalysis work that would become essential during the Cold War. Conclusion: the impact of signals intelligence on the Pacific War can be quantified in several ways. The number of Japanese ships sunk based on ultra-intelligence ran into the hundreds. The number of American lives saved by avoiding ambushes and preparing for attacks is incalculable. The strategic advantage gained by knowing Japanese intentions and capabilities shortened the war by months, possibly years. Some analysts have suggested that without the intelligence breakthrough at Midway, the Pacific War might have dragged on until 1946 or even 1947, with correspondingly higher casualties on both sides. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. After Midway, American commanders fought with confidence. They knew that Japanese moves would rarely come as a surprise. They could plan operations knowing that intelligence would warn them of Japanese countermoves. This confidence permeated down through the ranks. American airmen and sailors went into battle knowing that their commanders had good intelligence about what they would face. This knowledge boosted morale and fighting effectiveness. The Japanese, conversely, fought with growing uncertainty. Their plans kept failing in ways they couldn't explain. Their intelligence services couldn't penetrate American communications with the same success that Americans penetrated theirs. This intelligence imbalance contributed to Japan's eventual defeat as much as any material factor. The story of Station Hypo and the breaking of JN-25 is ultimately a story about the power of information in modern warfare. It shows that wars are won not just by powerful weapons and brave soldiers, but by analysts working in basement rooms, by linguists translating intercepted messages, by mathematicians finding patterns in chaos. The decision by Nimitz to trust Rochefort's intelligence, to commit his carriers based on decrypted messages, represents one of the great acts of command courage in military history. He was willing to risk everything on information that many of his peers considered too precise to be believable. His trust was vindicated by the greatest American naval victory of World War II. The lesson for future generations of military and intelligence professionals is clear. Intelligence is not an accessory to military operations. It is fundamental. A commander with good intelligence can make decisions that commanders without such intelligence cannot match. Resources invested in intelligence collection and analysis pay dividends far beyond their cost. The few hundred people working at Station Hypo with their IBM machines and their mathematical brilliance and their language skills contributed more to the Pacific War effort than many combat units 10 times their size. They didn't fight with guns. They fought with information, and information in the hands of commanders wise enough to use it proved to be the most powerful weapon of all. Their story stands as testament to the power of intelligence, to the importance of preparation, and to the courage of commanders willing to act on information even when conventional wisdom suggested caution. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Nimitz learned he could read every Japanese secret. 1 week later, he used that knowledge to win the Battle of Midway. The war in the Pacific would continue for 3 more years, but after Midway, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan's naval power was broken. America's industrial might would prevail. And it all began with a handful of analysts in a basement room in Hawaii who cracked the uncrackable code and gave their commander the power to see the future.